Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Patrick Nelson. I'm from Reach Markets, and I'm hosting a session today with Carl Bauer, who's joined us to talk on the topic of the banker mum and dad. I guess in reference to the challenges that we have in terms of young people buying into the property market, and it is something that a lot of parents want to help their kids into the property market. They're worried about their kids being able to actually get in there full stop, but it's not. It is a complex challenge, or it's a one-off challenge. You're only going to deal with it once or twice, right? But I guess depending on how many kids you've got, and and as a result, it's something. But you want to make sure if you do it properly, and there are some pitfalls. And I know. And when Carl wrote the article and I read the article, I guess it made me to reflect back on the experiences I had when I went into the property market, which are vastly different to what kids would be going through today. So, Carl, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Patrick, and thanks for allowing Reach Markets to deviate from their usual topics, and I hope your audience finds it useful.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And look, today's presentation, I'll just quickly note that, I'll have a look at what disclaimers I've got here. Good, we've got one of ours. Any advice in today's presentation is general only, doesn't take into consideration your personal circumstances, and you need to decide for yourself whether it's appropriate for you. Past returns are not an accurate indicator of future returns. All right. Now, during this presentation, if you've got any questions at all, please type them into the chat box. If it's relevant to what we're talking about at that point in time, I will read it out. Otherwise, we'll get into a Q&A conversation at the end of the presentation. And this is a picture of Carl. And I just want to go back to, I guess, my experience as way of an introduction here. When I bought my first property, it was 20 years ago. And at that point in time, I bought a house in South Caulfield. It cost me $220,000.
Wow.
And I think 4 years ago, I heard from someone who had bought a house not far from there and then seen the house that I used to live in on the market, and it sold for $1.4 million. Right, and so I think they'd done a little bit of work to the property, but in Maine that gain had occurred from growth in property values. Now, at the same time, and I remember I sold it 2 years later for twice what I bought it for, and went and bought another house, and off I went. Right, but for someone, you think about the impact that has on the younger generation. Right, in that I could go and buy a house, I could go live happily in that house. I don't care what anyone says about how hard they had it when they were younger, scrimping and saving so they could own a house. You're not going to be able to buy that house as a young person. Well, certainly not on the wage I was at, and the wage I was earning back there hasn't grown anywhere like the same rate. Right, so really just the quality of living that you're going to have, or the implication that's going to have for you over a long period of time, the amount of debt you're going to have to service, all of those challenges mean that younger people are probably steering away from actually being property owners, which is sad. And it means that if they are going to buy a house, they're not going to be living in the same community they grew up in. They have to move somewhere completely different, travel different out, all these sorts of challenges that are coming with property ownership. So, to get in, getting a leg up from your parents, then I imagine brings all sorts of other challenges. So, what happens if you loan money to your kids and they get divorced, or what happens if you loan kids to their money to your kids and they act like they've always acted, be a bit irresponsible,
or slamming the doors,
or all of a sudden it's a cash windfall as opposed to a loan to be used towards a house. Or what are the other challenges that I imagine that would be in there? So I think a really valuable topic, Carl, for you to come and talk to us about, and and thank you very much for joining us. But I'll hand over to yourself.
Thank you, Patrick. So just a little bit about that photo that's on the screen there, and about the business really. So my company, Bauer & Co Advisory, started in 2006. We're a boutique advisory practice. We work with a lot of accountants, lawyers, and other advisors, which is where a bit of a specialty in this family guarantee space has come from. And just as a business, we're all about teaching people how to repay debt, protect their assets, and build wealth. And that's that lending, insurance, and wealth screen that you've got on the screen there. So in terms of what we do, so as I said, we do a range of things, but mortgage broking is definitely our core business. And just in terms of the industry, mortgage brokers write almost 60% of all loans in Australia now. So There's many lenders with hundreds of products and literally thousands of options, and sorting through that takes time. So we're in one of the most complex residential loan industries in the world here in Australia, and we've just come out of 2 years of pretty aggressive regulatory change. The pendulum certainly swung in one direction a long way, and is now starting to return a little bit back towards the middle. So I guess the need for professional advice has never been greater. So a little bit about our process. So it's pretty straightforward. We're all about education information, and we can have as many meetings and discussions during this phase of the process as the client likes. Advice and options is certainly part 2, and implementation, so deciding an action, and then ongoing support. So just making sure that we're meeting regularly with clients post-settlement to ensure that we understand if anything has changed in their world, and they understand if anything has changed in the lending landscape that might impact the original structure and advice that was given. So on to the topic. So are your children locked out of the property market? Well, I guess this just depends on where they want to buy and what they want to buy, as Pat alluded to earlier. No doubt it's a very difficult market to enter. So December alone, so December 19, saw the fastest quarter of growth in 3 years, and momentum has certainly continued at the start of 2020. Last Saturday in Melbourne saw a huge result for February. So 1,223 auctions in Melbourne with a clearance rate of 73%, and the clearance rate in Sydney was 77%. So definitely big numbers for such an early time in the year. Melbourne in December 19 quarter was up 6%, so definitely racing ahead. And the median house price as of December in Melbourne was $860,000. So just talking about the difficulty to enter and price point, again, as Pat alluded to earlier. If we're talking about 860 as the median house price, the majority of mainstream lenders would go to, say, 95% of the valuation of that property as a maximum, which means that a prospective applicant would need to have at least $125,000 as a starting deposit to cover all of that 5% plus any costs, so stamp duty, etc. And then we've also got to factor in on top of that is a lender's mortgage insurance premium, which in this case would be in excess of $28,000. So big numbers, and I guess the ability to save at the rate of property price growth is just not possible these days in Melbourne. So Melbourne or Sydney. So it's what we're talking about today. So in terms of options, so your children or anyone looking to enter, rent vesting is an interesting subject and does get raised in the media from time to time. That's really just about renting for lifestyle, buying for investment. So you might be forced into a regional or a metro location at a lower entry price, continuing to rent. The goal there would obviously be accumulating equity and eventually buying an owner-occupied home. The next option would be property co-ownership. So CBA have actually got a good solution in this space, and this allows even friends or family, so siblings or parents, to go onto a title and actually buy a property together. But this can be a pretty messy solution with significant longer-term tax implications, and stamp duty can also be problematic if an owner decides to stay in that property and needs to buy the other party out. So certainly worth considering. Cash is obviously cash, so that's providing a loan or a gift to children needs to be done the right way, and considerations around opportunity costs should also be factored in. And onto what we're here about today is the limited guarantee. So this is a very popular way for parents to assist their children to enter the property market. So obviously we've seen incredible property price growth in Melbourne and Sydney in particular over the last 20 years. So I guess the equity that's available in parents' property can be utilised to assist their children. So on the left you've got a purchase price. This year showing this example here, purchase price of $800,000. the loan on that would be linked to that property only at 80%, and that would be in the borrower's name. So in this example, John Smith, the son. On the right-hand side of your screen is the parents' property or siblings' property. They can also get involved if they want to assist. So loan 2 would be up to a maximum of $210,000 in this case, which is the 20% of the purchase price plus costs. The borrower would still be John Smith, but in this loan it would be also assisted by the parents. So in this example, Jeff and Jane Smith, who'd both be guarantors. So the way to reduce that $210,000 is obviously just a cash contribution. That can come from the children or the parents. I'm seeing some parents doing a combination of both, where they'd be providing cash and equity just to reduce that risk against their property. So some of the benefits that need to be, I guess, understood here are definitely reduced variable interest rates for the children who are borrowing the money. So banks always price for risk. So they're interested in larger loans and larger equity positions. They will deliver lower rates and certainly eliminate those lenders' mortgage insurance costs if the loan satisfies their requirements. So in terms of the risks, definitely loan default. That's the big one. So you've got to understand that if the children default on this loan, your property is at risk. There are options for refinancing that loan into your name at that point in time, but yeah, the parents need to be aware that there is a first registered mortgage against their property from that lender, and it is at risk. So how we mitigate some of the risks? So certainly a binding financial agreement is recommended. So you should seek legal advice on this. It's especially important when cash is provided, as it can protect your capital in the event of separation and eventual property settlement, division of assets, etc. Estate planning, so that's just referring to wills. Get your affairs in order and make sure things are protected and estates are distributed as per the wishes of the owner. Insurance is certainly the next one. We always encourage our clients to go down the path of insurance in any case, but even more important when a parent's property is at risk. So making sure that they've got income protection and all of the life insurance, TPD, trauma insurance, etc. in place. It's the foundation of any good financial plan. And lastly, another way to mitigate risk is potentially taking an interest-only loan on the larger 680k loan in that previous example, and that's just an option, but it just allows more surplus cash to be diverted towards the guarantor loan, which really should be the focus of accelerated debt reduction for the child, because that's the one that we want to get rid of first and therefore release the parent's property as quickly as possible. So in terms of an action plan, so advice, certainly in a pretty complicated lending environment that's continually changing, and we've seen the introduction of new standards such as comprehensive credit reporting and open banking is on its way. As I said at the start of this presentation, the need for professional advice has never been greater, and getting that structure right is absolutely critical. So making sure that we separate those debts for ease of identification and for the guarantor loan. So as I said, that can be reduced first. That's really, really important. Documentation, so making sure, again, this follows on from the legal advice recommendation, just making sure that you have things documented. The binding financial agreement is absolutely critical. We talked about the potential for a relationship breakdown and what that means to the original deposit that you may have provided, the original cash contribution that you may have provided, just protecting the capital. So is a new will required and so forth. Structure is the next one. So as I said earlier, so structure is absolutely critical, making sure that we've split those debts and we've protected them as much as possible. So planning, so making sure that that your children understand risk and understand money management. So if the contribution is repayable, so if you've provided a deposit and that is repayable to you as a loan, or directly to the lender under a guarantee structure, there should be a really clear debt repayment and exit plan to focus on the release of the guarantor's property as quickly as possible. So we do things like stress testing at higher interest rates to make sure they can afford repayments at those higher levels, and what that actually looks like at those higher interest rate levels. We also take into consideration reduced income levels and making sure that the kids are really aware of what they're getting themselves into and the types of risks that they're undertaking. So lastly, insurance. So as I said earlier, so making sure the children are seeking professional advice around risk insurance, and that's detailed planning around income protection and so forth. And lastly, the reviews. So making sure that if a contribution is repayable, so if you've provided a deposit to children and they're repaying that to you, either directly or to a lender under a guarantee structure, we make sure that we regularly review the child's property value in particular and borrowing capacity, just to ensure that we're not in a set and forget type arrangement, and the guarantor property is not unnecessarily delayed in terms of release for and then exposing the parents to an extended period of risk. So that's really the most important thing. So hopefully those 6 action plan points gives you something to take away. I don't have anything else to add to that other than to thank everyone for their time, and of course, if you wanted to learn more, there's some contact details on the screen, and
or you can just type in yes into the chat box. Now we've got some time for questions. Now there have been different ways people can buy into property. Recently, I was at an event and someone was talking about fractoring. It was a company that you could buy a share in a property. I mean, have you come across that? Have people come and spoken to you about that?
No one's actually spoken to me directly about it, but I have seen those companies starting to pop up. As the technology becomes more prevalent. I think there's one called Domicom, I think.
That was the one I was talking.
Yeah. So it's interesting. It's very interesting. But no one's come to me at this stage. Obviously it's a very illiquid asset, a property. So you're effectively buying shares in a property.
You're getting property exposure, but the benefit of that property might be hard to.
But no one's gone that far down the path as yet, but be interesting to see where it all lands.
Yeah. Okay. You mentioned some steps here. So advice, documentation, structure, planning, insurance. So is this something that if you were to sit down with someone who was coming to you with this challenge, what would be the process that you would go through?
Yeah. So we undertake a really detailed client profiling process, so we understand their situation in absolute detail. We would then interview their parents or whoever's providing the guarantee to make sure they understand their child's situation and also their risks. So that's just as a very first point of call. That's one of the first things we'll do in the process, and then we'll also collect information from parents just to make sure that the asset position stacks up, and there are some pretty stringent requirements that have been changing at lenders now for guarantor loans. They really are making sure that the person who's providing the guarantee is able to do so without putting themselves under any financial stress. So that's kind of the first, as I said, client profiling process, and then we work through research and advice really, and that's just understanding who does what in the market and presenting options, a range of options, guiding them towards a solution, and then we manage the process from start to finish. And as part of that process, of course, we'll discuss structure in absolute detail. We'll work with them on debt repayment plans, and we'll certainly be referring them to insurance specialists that can assist.
Yeah. Okay. So would it be sort of the first step is if you were interested, would it be to just have a chat about what you were looking at, be it coming from the parent or from the from the person who actually wants to buy the property's perspective. So have a quick chat, outline the situation, and then you could sort of high level lead them in the right direction, and then from there there's if it made sense, they could proceed from there.
Certainly, always start with a phone call, have a quick 5 to 10 minute chat and understand their situation in a little bit of detail, and then we move forward with that client profiling.
Okay, all right, beautiful. If anyone else has got any other questions on the line, please shoot them through. Have you seen, you know, in these sort of situations where people go into this, what have been the main challenges that you found have to be worked through between the relationship between the parents and their siblings or their kids?
It's always an uncomfortable conversation. I think is you know, there can be a perceived moral obligation for parents to provide it, but I really encourage strongly to go and sit in front of a solicitor jointly together. So, you know, that solicitor can ask questions that neither party would have even thought of, and it usually is around exit, because there, as I said, there's a first registered mortgage over the parents' property, and they need to understand what that restrictions, how that actually restricts them from, you know, being able to sell that property for retirement or exit, particularly if it's linked to their owner-occupied property. We'd always prefer to link it to an unencumbered, a debt-free investment property if possible, but that's not always the case. So,
I imagine that another challenge would be the siblings. So one child gets a loan, then what happens to the rest of the family? And you mentioned something around estate planning, so that can sort of be handled through good estate planning. Is that
Absolutely, yeah. And I've actually worked with 3 brothers of the one family and the one parent's property, investment property, and they all took over the course of about 5 years. They all came to me, and we worked through a pretty detailed structure, and were able to provide the same limited guarantee for each child at the same time.
But you might have a situation where one child needs the loan to buy the house and another doesn't, or doesn't want to buy a house, or whatever it might be. And in those instances, you need to think ahead, because it could be problematic, or there could be this perception of fairness, which is where often issues arise from. And you know, the estate planning side of that can handle that. So that the interests of everyone are preserved as you go through that process.
A good will planning process is absolutely critical.
Now the other, reading your article, the other thing that was noted was about you know, the spouse. So say there's a divorce, you're worried about, okay, well, what happens? I don't want to just go and buy this house and give half of it away. But what practically occurs if that happens? So if you have the loan set up, how would you suggest, what is the protection that's in place in that instance that you would be suggesting?
Yeah, so certainly if it's a cash contribution from parents, so a binding financial agreement is kind of just a starting point. And as I said, that's always the uncomfortable conversation, because you are talking about effectively a form of prenup. So the parents are getting their money back if something goes wrong in the child's relationship, and there are, you know, that's good risk management 101, really. You need to sit down with a lawyer and understand how to actually structure that up. So essentially all would happen if the worst case did arise and the child's relationship broke down and a property settlement ensued, upon the sale of that property, the parents would be guaranteed to get their cash back from any deposit.
So they get their cash back, or are they getting their percentage of the property?
Well, that's a good question.
Back? And is that the sort of structure will determine the answer to that? Right? So you know, that's something really to think about.
And that opportunity cost.
If you're going into it, would be, if I structure this in an appropriate way, am I protecting the interests of my child? And structuring that, you might be in a position where you can really do that, or you might be in a position where, you know, your property triples in price, you provided the equity in that property, and then, you know, things unwind. Are you just getting your cash back, or are you in fact getting your percentage of the property back? And I guess with that would be the alternative, is property prices went down and unfolded, you know, that you're at a loss. But there's things to think about in that process. But I think, you know, if it's something you want to go through, there is an appropriate way of doing it, and there are people that can advise, and Carl is one of those people. So if you would like to get more information, type yes into the chat box, or as you bump out of this session, there'll be a survey. You can just ask for more information, and we can get Carl to provide that to you. Other than that, if you've got any further questions, you can drop them in the survey on your way out. You can contact us and we can put you in contact with Carl. But thank you very much for coming along to the session today. Carl, thank you very much. Very informative. Much appreciated.
Thanks, Pat, and thank you, everyone.